As all the fighting we've talked about in previous videos was going on in 1861 and 1862 in the East, in places like Virginia and a little bit in Maryland, there was also another theater of the war in the West, primarily in Tennessee. And the fighting there was going on simultaneously. In this video, I'm going to talk about the fighting in the West from 1861 to 1862, which revolved around mainly control of the Mississippi and control of Tennessee and the Mississippi River, which was the boundary of western Tennessee. The first real battle was for central Tennessee, which I've already mentioned was really important. There were this was, some key agricultural lands in the South, but mainly it was a crossroads. It included, among the other of interesting things the Union wanted, the tributaries to the Mississippi. Leading the attack on this part of Tennessee was United States General Ulysses S. Grant. He moved southward into Tennessee, leading what would eventually be called the Union Army of Tennessee. I'll talk more about Grant's background, of course, in later videos, because he's, of course, going to become a president of the United States. After some initial victories in Kentucky and smaller victories in 1861, Grant moved on two Confederate forts that guarded some rivers, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, shown here. Grant had prepared to attack Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862. There defending was Confederate General John Floyd, and you can see him here, although he's not in uniform. Fort Donelson was Floyd's headquarters, and he had 21,000 troops there. Grant had no trouble taking Fort Henry, but Fort Donelson would be more difficult. It was high on a bluff overlooking the Cumberland River, which you can see in the picture on the right. To make matters worse for Grant, his forces had left their winter gear, as it was mid-February and spring-like weather, and they were heading south, they figured. As it happened, the warm weather ended and a cold front moved in with snow and sleet. So when the Battle of Fort Donelson took place between February 12th and February 16th, 1862, Grant's victory was kind of a surprise. Floyd was too hesitant, and Grant pushed his troops to assault. Surprisingly, Floyd decided to surrender quickly. He'd been a U.S. Secretary of War, and he feared being executed as a traitor. He chickened out, essentially, and he appointed a subordinate to surrender, and he cowardly escaped beforehand by boat. Interestingly, one Confederate general, Nathan Bedford Forrest, was infuriated by Floyd's cowardice and took some troops and escaped before Grant took Fort Donelson. He kind of proved that had Floyd been more proactive and not hesitant and cowardly, his troops might have at least escaped along with him. Forrest, of course, was founder of the KKK after the war, and I guess if you've seen Forrest Gump, that's whom Forrest Gump's named for. In any event, after Grant took Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in mid-February 1862, the Confederates knew they had no hope of defending Nashville in the middle of the state. Accordingly, Grant's troops continued to march southward to occupy Nashville on February 23rd, 1862, and the Confederates simply withdrew. Throughout March 1862, both sides sort of restocked and organized for a new fight. Grant's Army of Tennessee, the Union Army of Tennessee, ballooned up to 48,000 men. Here you can see a picture of them. The Confederates, meanwhile, mustered 44,000 troops under General Albert Sidney Johnston. Note, be careful, it's not Joseph E. Johnston who had been fighting in the East, although they had the same name. Albert Sidney Johnston was widely regarded as a great general, having been commander of the U.S. forces in the Pacific region before the war. The resulting fight was famous and came at Shiloh, Tennessee in early April 6th to 7th, 1862. Shiloh, like Antietam, was known as one of the worst battles, but its name ironically means place of peace. The Confederate Johnston moved to attack first, hoping for a surprise attack. His second in command, General Beauregard, who had returned from the East, said, "Don't attack because the Union troops know where we are." In reality, Union pickets had actually seen Confederate movements, but Grant's second in command, General William Tecumseh Sherman, shown here, insisted that the pickets were just nervous and they hadn't actually seen anybody. Sherman, of course, is going to become later famous in the war. The Battle of Shiloh in April 1862 was bloody from the outset. Much of the fighting was in the thickets of dense forest, and soldiers on both sides often, fired at each other. It was so confusing. The Confederates rallied under Johnston's personal command in the bloody Peach Orchard, and you can see a picture of that here. Johnston, however, was mortally hit in the leg. He at first didn't think it was serious, but soon figured out that he'd nicked an artery. He had, unfortunately, sent his personal surgeon elsewhere, and nobody with him knew anything about tourniquets. Within a few minutes, Johnston bled to death, and the South had thus lost a general that might have been, or probably was, as good as Lee was proving in the East at the same time. Here's an historical marker showing where Albert Sidney Johnston died. As Johnston fought in the Peach Orchard, his second in command, Beauregard, shelled the Union position known as the Hornet's Nest. Bullets and cannonballs were said to be flying like the hornets. In this area, Union troops retreated, but they did allow Grant time to reorganize and recoup the initiative. Here's a picture of the Hornet's Nest today, which of course is a national park. When Grant got reinforcements, he slowly pushed General Beauregard, now the top Confederate commander after Johnston had died, to retreat back to Corinth, Mississippi. So I guess you could say because the Confederates had given the field, it was a Union victory. But it was a costly Union victory. Grant's Union Army of Tennessee lost 13,000 of their troops, while the Confederates lost 11,000 of theirs. What shocked people was that in only 2 days of battle, Americans in total had lost almost 25,000 soldiers. That was more than all the American wars in its history to that point. Here you can see a cemetery in outside Shiloh of some of the graves. After Grant's victory at Shiloh, the overall American commander, General Henry Halleck, shown on the left, and he was back in Washington, relieved Grant of command, ostensibly because Grant was developing a reputation for drinking, but probably because Halleck was jealous of Grant's military success. Below on the right is some of the correspondence between Halleck and Grant. In any event, Halleck ordered Grant's former army, the Union Army of Tennessee, to continue to advance. As I say, after their loss at Shiloh, the Confederates retreated to Corinth, Mississippi, right below the Tennessee borderline. The Union Army of Tennessee then advanced on Corinth from Shiloh, but the Confederate General Beauregard decided not to fight and evacuated the Confederate Army of Tennessee from the city without Jefferson Davis' approval. And Jefferson Davis was outraged, saying that Beauregard had taken an, quote, unauthorized leave of absence. Jefferson Davis replaced the Creole Beauregard with General Braxton Bragg. He was known for discipline and for executing deserters. If you're familiar with the U.S. Army, there's a Fort Bragg in North Carolina's named for him. At least it is at the time of this video. They're talking about renaming U.S. military bases after Confederates. But anyway, by this point, as I say, the Confederates Army of Tennessee was actually out of Tennessee. So it's kind of interesting. They're in northern Mississippi at Corinth. Now, as this fighting was going on, there's also additional fighting going on in the West. Further south, at the Battle of New Orleans. There, just after the Battle of Shiloh in early April 1862, U.S. Admiral David Farragut, shown here, led a fleet to take New Orleans. Really, it was part of Scott's Anaconda plan to work up the Mississippi River and to gain control of the Mississippi River. Guarding New Orleans was two forts downstream on the Mississippi, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, you can see here. The Confederates thought getting past the big guns at these forts was impossible, and they kind of had a false sense of security. Matter of fact, many Louisiana soldiers were shipped off to fight for the Confederates in the north in Tennessee and then even in Virginia. The Confederates decided to string a large chain boom across the river to serve as a barrier. They also reserved a few gunboats up the river closer to New Orleans. On Good Friday, April 18th, 1862, just after the Battle of Shiloh, Admiral Farragut's large fleet began an extended bombing of the two forts. They sent a Union vessel up to cut the chain, hidden, and they hoped that under the darkness of night it'd get up there, and it did. Farragut then sent 17 warships up the river. The forts, it turned out, had some bad gunpowder, and they coordinated poorly with their gunboats. When the all-night fighting had ended, 14 of the 17 Union vessels had made it past Fort Jackson and Fort Phillip and were heading towards New Orleans. With New Orleans then undefended, Farragut sent 2 officers to demand the city's unconditional surrender. They bravely walked past angry mobs, yelling and spitting at them, some calling for the 2 to be lynched. The mayor didn't want the city destroyed, for no reason really, and so agreed to the unconditional surrender. Once occupied by Union forces, New Orleans women, in particular, but others as well, would curse Union soldiers and turn their backs on the soldiers when they walked by, or even spit on them. Some of them dumped chamber pots on their heads. In response, the Union Army issued what became known as Woman's Order Number 28. The Women's Order said that if the insults didn't stop, Union soldiers would no longer treat the women as ladies. If insulted, a soldier would insult back. If spat upon, the soldier could spit back. Southerners had always put their white women on pedestals as exemplars of virtue and virginity. It was the female version of honor I've talked about in videos past. The Women's Order Number 28 was therefore, really controversial. It did work, it stopped it, but the Union general, leading it is going to be hated by the Southerners in New Orleans. Here's a flyer showing some of the Southern outrage. Southern men avenge their wrongs, the women's wrongs, it says. The general that issued the Women's Order Number 28 was a General Benjamin F. Butler, and you can see him here. He was so hated that New Orleans residents called him the Beast. The Confederate Congress branded him a war criminal and promised to hang him if he was captured. The New Orleans black market, meanwhile, sold chamber pots with Butler's picture on it. Butler became so daggone controversial that Lincoln ended up relieving him of his command just to help keep peace in the city. After winning the Battle of New Orleans, the Union Army took Baton Rouge in Louisiana and then began to advance up the Mississippi River to Vicksburg, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee. Vicksburg and Memphis, further up the river, were the remaining key river cities the South still owned. They were both fortresses. If they were going to control the Mississippi, the North, and thus fulfill, Winfield Scott's Anacostia plan, they had to take these 2 cities, and that would split the Confederacy. So as Farragut's fleet took New Orleans and the Union Navy advanced up the Mississippi towards Vicksburg, another Union fleet was floating down the Mississippi from the north towards Memphis. The resulting Battle of Memphis on June 6, 1862, proved to be an easy Union victory, surprisingly so. The Union fleet had 6 good Ironsides, which completely destroyed the Confederate river fleet guarding the city. What the loss at the Battle of Memphis meant was the Confederates really only had Vicksburg holding both sides of the Mississippi together. And, thus the Confederates began to dig in dramatically to reinforce the city of Vicksburg. They didn't want the Confederacy cut in half. Before I conclude this video on fighting in the Tennessee, the West Theater from 1861 to 1862, let me add that there was a little bit of fighting in Texas and for control of New Mexico territory. There, a Confederate army under General Henry Hopkins Sibley, shown here, is going to try to control New Mexico territory. The idea was to raise an army in Texas, Sibley, and then march through New Mexico territory and ultimately end up in California. And this way, they get not only all the cattle-rich Southwest, but they might have access to the gold, any gold in California and other minerals, which they hope might keep funding the Confederate war effort. It was probably an ambitious plan. Sibley's forces took El Paso and then moved north to attack Santa Fe. And you can see his passage here. Sibley's ragtag Army of New Mexico, they called it, with their White Star flag. You can see that in this picture. They only had about 3,000 men, and they faced several small engagement of Union forces, and they usually took all their objectives through Santa Fe. The problem was that the Union Army kept retreating and burning and destroying all supplies, agriculture, and killing all the cows. It was an early version of what we later called the scorched earth policy. And, heading west from Santa Fe, once into the desert, how the heck is Sibley's Army of New Mexico going to keep advancing without supplies? And thus, in the end, they ended up turning around and returning to Texas. As far as California was concerned, in the very far west, there were no really big fighting, no big armies. For those of you who have been to San Francisco, maybe you've been there, the Union did build a huge fort at the mouth of San Francisco Bay at the southern end. And if you've been there, it's right at the foot of the Golden Gate Bridge. They also fortified Alcatraz Island in the harbor. In any event, this concludes the video on fighting in the Western Theater, primarily Tennessee, almost all Tennessee, in the years 1861 to 1862.